40 years ago, the United States Department of Agriculture published a quiet report on a root vegetable that produced more food per square meter than carrots, beets, or turnips, survived winter temperatures down to minus 20 degrees Celsius without protection, and regrew from the same root year after year without replanting. The report described it as one of the most efficient cold climate food crops ever studied, capable of feeding a family from a patch of ground smaller than a parking space. It tasted sweet, slightly nutty, and could be eaten raw, boiled, roasted, or fried. It needed no fertilizer, almost no water, and resisted nearly every pest known to attack root crops. And then, like so many other promising crops before it, the research stopped. Funding moved elsewhere. Agricultural departments quietly shifted focus. And within a generation, this plant disappeared from seed catalogs, vanished from supermarket shelves, and was reclassified in many regions as an ornamental curiosity or worse, a noxious weed to be eradicated from roadsides. The plant is called skirret. Its scientific name is Cicerum, and it belongs to the same family as carrots and parsley. But unlike carrots, which must be sown from seed every single year, demanding fresh soil, careful watering, and constant thinning, skirret is a perennial. You plant it once, and it returns season after season, producing thick clusters of sweet white roots that look like a bundle of pale fingers reaching down into the earth. It was once one of the most prized vegetables in Europe. The Emperor Tiberius reportedly demanded it as tribute from Germanic tribes. Medieval monastery gardens cultivated it as a staple. In the 16th and 17th centuries, English cookbooks described skirret pie as a delicacy fit for royal tables. And then sugar arrived from the colonies. The potato spread across the continent, and skirret, with its slightly fibrous core and its refusal to fit neatly into industrial farming systems, was pushed aside and almost completely forgotten. I came across skirret almost by accident. A neighbor who keeps an old garden gave me a small clump of roots wrapped in damp newspaper. He told me his grandmother had grown them, that they tasted like sweet parsnips with a hint of carrot, and that once you planted them, you would never have to plant them again. I did not believe him at first, but I had an empty corner of the vegetable bed, so I dug a small trench, separated the roots, and pressed them into the soil. That was 4 years ago. Since then, I have not bought a single carrot from the supermarket in winter, because every autumn that same patch gives me more skirret than my family can eat. Let me explain what makes this plant so remarkable, because the more you understand about it, the harder it becomes to accept that almost nobody grows it anymore. Skirret produces what botanists call a cluster of fasciculated roots. Instead of forming one single taproot like a carrot, it sends down between 10 and 20 pencil-thick white roots from a central crown. Each of those roots can reach 15 to 20 centimeters in length, and together they form a dense bundle that comes out of the ground in a single handful. The flesh is white, crisp, and surprisingly sweet. The sweetness comes partly from natural sugars, and partly from a compound that becomes more concentrated after the first frosts. That is one of the most interesting things about this plant. It actually tastes better in winter. Cold weather, instead of damaging the roots, converts some of their starch into sugar, the same way it does with parsnips. So while other root vegetables are losing quality in storage, skirret left in the ground is improving. With skirret, you plant once. The first year you wait while the crown establishes itself. From the second year onward, you simply dig up part of the cluster in autumn or early winter, take the thick roots for the kitchen, replant the smaller roots and the crown, and walk away until the following autumn. The plant does the rest. It produces tall, feathery foliage that looks attractive in a garden bed. It flowers in midsummer with small white umbels that attract pollinators, and it survives winters that would kill most vegetables outright. I have left skirret in the ground through nights of minus 18 degrees, and the next spring it sent up new shoots as if nothing had happened. There is no need for mulch, no need for row covers, no need for tunnels or fleece. The plant simply pulls back into the root, waits, and resumes growth when the soil warms again. For anyone living in a cold climate, where the gardening season feels short and every frost feels like a deadline, this changes the entire calculation of what is worth growing. Let me tell you how to plant it, because the method is so simple that it almost feels like there must be a catch. Skirret can be started from seed, but I would not recommend it for a first attempt. The seed is small, slow to germinate, and the seedlings need patience. The far easier method is to start from root divisions or offsets, which is exactly how it has been propagated for centuries. You take an established crown, separate the smaller roots and side shoots from the main cluster, and replant them. Each piece will form a new plant. You plant them in early spring, about 30 centimeters apart, in soil that has been loosened to a depth of at least 25 centimeters. Skirret prefers moist soil. In fact, in the wild it grows along stream banks and damp meadows. So if you have a low spot in the garden where water sits a little longer after rain, that is exactly where this plant wants to be. The soil does not need to be especially rich. I planted mine in ground that had grown almost nothing the year before. A little compost worked into the planting hole is enough. Too much nitrogen, just like with yacon or carrots, pushes the plant to produce leaves at the expense of roots. What skirret really wants is consistent moisture during the growing season and a soil that drains well in winter. Standing water in summer is fine, but waterlogged ground in January can rot the crowns. Once planted, the plant grows quietly through spring and summer. By July, the stems reach about a meter tall, sometimes a little more. The white flowers appear in midsummer, and if you let them go to seed, you can collect seed for the following year. But honestly, division is so much easier and faster that most people never bother with seed at all. The plant takes care of its own multiplication. From one crown planted in the spring, by the second autumn, you will have enough material to plant 5 or 6 more crowns, and so the patch expands on its own without any extra cost. The harvest is the part that surprises people the most. You wait until the first hard frosts have hit, which is usually mid to late autumn depending on your region. The frost is not optional. It is what triggers the conversion of starch into sugar, and it is what gives skirret its characteristic sweetness. Once the foliage has died back, you take a digging fork, loosen the soil around the plant, and lift the whole cluster carefully. What comes out looks almost surreal. A pale white bundle of fingers, each one about as thick as a pencil, all joined at a central crown. You twist or cut off the thicker roots for the kitchen, and you replant the crown along with the thinner roots immediately. That is the entire process. 10 minutes per plant, and you have food for weeks. In the kitchen, skirret is genuinely versatile. The flavor reminds me of a cross between a sweet parsnip and a young carrot, with a faintly nutty finish. The texture, when cooked, becomes soft and almost creamy, which makes it ideal for purees and soups. I peel the roots, cut them into pieces, and roast them with olive oil and rosemary, exactly the way I would roast parsnips. They caramelize beautifully because of their sugar content, developing golden edges and a flavor that is somehow both familiar and entirely new. They can be boiled and mashed with butter, mixed into stews, fried as chips, or grated raw into winter salads. The only thing to be aware of is the central core. Older roots can develop a slightly fibrous string running through the middle. It is not inedible, but it is woody, and most people prefer to remove it before cooking. With younger roots, this is not an issue at all. There is a nutritional side to this story that deserves attention. Skirret roots contain significant amounts of potassium, calcium, and iron, along with a type of soluble fiber that acts as a prebiotic in the gut, similar to what we see in yacon and other traditional root crops. The natural sweetness comes partly from a small fraction of fructose-based compounds rather than pure sucrose, which means the impact on blood sugar is gentler than that of refined sugar. This is not a miracle food, and I am not claiming it cures anything. but it is a nutrient-dense, low-calorie, gut-friendly root that performs in the kitchen like a vegetable and tastes like a small reward. Now comes the question that always arrives sooner or later. If this plant is so productive, so easy, so cold-hardy, and so delicious, why did it disappear from gardens and from commerce? The answer is the same answer that explains so many forgotten crops. Skirret does not fit the industrial model. Its roots are too thin and irregular to be washed, sorted, and packaged on the same machinery designed for carrots. The cluster has to be hand-separated. The harvest cannot be mechanized in the way modern root crop production demands. The plant is perennial, which means a farmer cannot sell new seed every year to the same customer. The roots do not store as long in commercial cold rooms as carrots do, because their high sugar content makes them prone to soft spots. And perhaps most damning of all, skirret produces a slightly different yield every year depending on weather, soil, and division technique. Industrial agriculture wants predictability, uniformity, and scale. Skirret offers abundance, but on its own terms. For a home garden, none of these limitations matter. You are not loading a truck. You are not stocking a supermarket. You are walking out to a patch of ground in November, lifting a cluster of roots, and bringing dinner to the kitchen. The supposed disadvantages of skirret are precisely what make it perfect for self-sufficiency. It does not need a supply chain. It does not need a label. It does not need to look identical to every other root in the box. It just needs a small patch of moist ground and a gardener willing to plant it once. I want to give you a few practical tips that I have learned from these 4 years of growing it. First, choose your spot carefully. Skirret will live in the same place for many years, so pick a corner of the garden where it will not be in the way of annual crops. Second, mark the patch. The foliage dies back completely in winter, and it is surprisingly easy to forget exactly where the plants are when spring planting begins. Third, divide every 2 or 3 years. If you leave a clump undisturbed for too long, the central crown gets crowded and the roots become thinner. Lifting and replanting in autumn refreshes the patch and gives you a harvest at the same time. Fourth, do not be afraid to share. A single mature plant gives more divisions than any one household needs. And giving away crowns is one of the small joys of growing forgotten plants. The more gardens that contain skirret, the harder it is for this plant to be lost again. There is something deeper at work here, beyond the practical question of what to plant in a cold winter garden. Skirret represents a kind of food that the modern world has slowly trained us to forget exists. Food that you plant once and harvest forever. Food that improves with frost instead of being killed by it. Food that asks nothing from a supply chain because it lives in your soil. When you grow a plant like this, you start to notice something. The carrot aisle stops feeling like a necessity. The seed catalog stops feeling like the only source of food. The garden starts to feel less like a project you restart every spring, and more like a living system you tend over years. If you have a patch of ground that gets sun for part of the day, holds moisture reasonably well, and is not in the path of foot traffic or machinery, consider planting skirret this coming spring. Find a gardener who already grows it, or order roots from one of the small heritage seed companies that still carry it. Plant 5 or 6 crowns. Wait through the first season, and then, in the second autumn, dig up that first harvest and taste what people have been forgetting for the last 300 years. If you enjoy discovering forgotten crops, simple methods, and ways to produce more food with less effort, subscribe to the channel and join us in the next videos.